This is episode 8 of season 1 of Babylon 5 and the Sky Full of Stars. This is going to be a long one. This is an arc episode, and it is quite a significant arc episode for reasons that will become clear. So I'm going to do my normal recap of the episode, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it in detail afterwards. So we start in the Arrivals Lounge, where a gentleman gets his identity card checked, and immediately he makes a connection with someone who is sat reading a paper in the Arrivals Lounge, who I immediately recognised at the time as Khan's second in command. I found a little bit wooden, if I'm honest, in this episode, in the same way that I found the Man from U.N.C.L.E. a little bit wooden in an earlier episode. So, it's interesting that they chose to use him as a part here, but interestingly, he isn't really the main part of this little duo. So we'll not worry too much about it. I shall move on. Next, we see a security guard called Benson getting roughhoused by two very delightful gentlemen. It's apparent that he's in too deep with them. He owes them credits, and he's owing credits to the wrong crowd, particularly given that he's a security guard. So he's actually quite critical to this entire episode, strangely enough. It seems like he's a sort of a minor part, but he's actually critical, and we'll find out why soon. Now, the new arrival is in his quarters, starting to set up when his connection arrives at his quarters, and it's apparent that he's expecting trouble because he gets a knife out to go and answer the door with. So there's a question mark over what their background is. Given the previous episodes that we've seen, I wondered initially whether or not they were perhaps home guard, but we'll leave that speculation for the time being. Whoever they are, they're busy making something, but it's not apparent just what at the moment. So Benson has been called before Garibaldi and Sinclair, and he's basically been a bad lad at the casino. He's been exceeding the 50 credits that he's allowed to bet by putting side bets on, and they're on to him. And he's basically denying everything. He's decided that he can't afford, for the sake of his career, to admit anything. And Sinclair asks Garibaldi to find out the truth. And Michael says that he knows that the guy's lying. And Sinclair says that everyone lies, Michael. The trick is to find out why. It turns out that the new arrivals are lacking a power source for whatever it is that they're building. Not something they could have brought onto the station because it would have been too easily detectable. But the guy who had already arrived says that it's in hand and it should be with them shortly. At which point the scene shifts and we see that Benson is using his identity card to access an area which is somewhat restricted. The scene then shifts completely to Franklin running a medical scanner over the length of Delen's body, explaining that he's never really had a chance to scan a fully healthy Minbari before. Normally he only sees them when they've already got something wrong with them. And she asks Franklin what he did during the Earth-Minbari War, and it turns out that he used to hitchhike on starships, but he's basically trading his services as a doctor for passage. My immediate question was, where's his towel? I mean, he clearly doesn't have his towel anywhere near him, which is shocking, quite frankly. But anyway, she asks whether or not he had any part in the war, and he explains that whilst Earth Force were interested in any notes that he might have had on the Minbari, he was loath to give them over to him, and so he actually destroyed them rather than giving them over to be used in sort of genetic weapons and that sort of thing. And Delen thanks him for that, because he explains that his oath was to protect all life, not just human life. Franklin then perfectly reasonably asked Delen what she was doing during the war, and she completely dodges the question and then leaves. Benson has now delivered a nice chunky energy pod to the duo, and they now have what they need to carry on. And Benson, it seems, has also got what he was promised, albeit not a transfer off the station. In Sinclair's quarters, we see that he's dreaming about the Battle of the Line, which was the final confrontation of the Earth-Minbari War. And we see a sort of a tri-wing Minbari fighter with green beam weapons engaging Star Furies, and they're in trouble. It's a trap, basically. In an Akbar style, it's a trap. And Sinclair wakes up sweating before we see too much of what went on. And he realises that his equivalent of Alexa is not talking to him, and perhaps more disturbingly, his link, his personal communicator, is down as well. He gets dressed, leaves his quarters, but the screens are down everywhere on the station, and there are no other bodies on the station either, so it's far, far too quiet. And he makes his way up to the command and control deck, which is deserted and dark. And he tries to use the main command deck to call out for assistance to Earth, and then to any ships in grid Epsilon, which is the area that Babylon 5 is positioned in. After a little pause, the computer does come back online, and he asks whether an evacuation order has been given for the station, and the computer responds in the negative, and that it can only detect one other life form on the station in the central corridor. So Sinclair heads down there, and the lights start going out around him one by one, and the computer is now unresponsive again. But Sinclair is not alone. So the later of the duo to arrive is with him. And apparently Sinclair is his, wherever he is. There's a great shot of a newspaper in the next scene change, and I paused it because I'd never looked at this closely before. I think I knew of it. The paper is called The Universe Today, and it's absolutely bang on in terms of what it's reporting on. So it's completely in universe. So there's a reference to a Home Guard operative having been caught bombing a Minbari embassy. We note that San Diego is radioactive. The Psi Corps is supporting Vice President in the election, which is apparently is anti-Psi Corps rules. So there's a big question mark over whether or not they should be doing it. The Narns have settled the Ragesh 3 controversy, which of course refers back to the first episode, Midnight on the Firing Line. And it's just all lovely, lovely linked in details. But I think unless you had a really big screen TV at the time this was on and paused it, obviously you wouldn't be able to get any of this. This is the sort of analysis you can only do these days now, when you can actually pause things and look at them in detail on a decent screen. But it's a tribute to how far through everything is thought that they've bothered to make a paper which actually contains little sort of plot hints and plot references as to what's gone before. So brilliant if you're coming into this for the first time. So it's Garibaldi who's reading this paper in his office, and Glenn's come in to tell him that Sinclair is overdue to meet with her, and that apparently Ivanova hasn't seen him either. So obviously Garibaldi is concerned by this because it's not in Sinclair's nature to go missing in this way. And we see that where Sinclair was not real, basically. He is caught up in what's called a cerebral matrix. It's a virtual reality prison for Sinclair's mind. And just to demonstrate this, he's shown various copies of Garibaldi, one of whom is shot by the guy who arrived, but then another one just takes his place, and they're popping up all over the place. But interestingly, he then demonstrates to Sinclair that the pain that he feels in this reality is real, and he gives him a good solid blast with a sort of a beam of energy, just for good measure, to demonstrate this fact. Sinclair asks why they're doing this to him, and the guy explains that 10 years ago he was at the Battle of the Line, and that for 24 hours he was out of touch with Earth Force defence. Sinclair says that he blacked out, but his interrogator doesn't believe him, and he's determined to get the truth through his memories, even if Sinclair has to die to get it. On the command and control deck, the command staff are trying to narrow down the possibilities of where he could be, whether or not he might have gone off ship, or whether or not he's been spaced out of an airlock, for example. All pretty grim stuff. Back in the virtual reality, his interrogator is running through his biography, his career history. So we learn that he's 39 years old, that he was born on Mars, and that's interesting because I think that confirms that obviously Terrans are being born on Mars, which means there has to be a fairly established colony there. And we also learn that he's a career officer from a long line of career officers, but for whatever reason, Sinclair's career has kind of stalled, because by now he probably ought to be an admiral, but he's still just a commander. So there's a slight question mark there over why that should be the case. We flash back again in Sinclair's timeline to his friend Mitchell on the line. This time we see a full Minbari cruiser sort of completely dwarfing the Star Furies. And Mitchell is trying to shoot down a Minbari fighter, but he's hopelessly outmatched. And his fighter is damaged and he tries to eject, but even as he's trying to eject, the remains of his fighter are just blown out from around him and he's gone. And back in the sim environment, Mitchell's ghost accuses Sinclair of having betrayed them all. And we switch back to the space scene again, and we see Sinclair hitting afterburners to try and ram a Minbari cruiser. But he says to his interrogator that beyond that point he just doesn't remember anything. Something passed before his eyes and he blacked out. And the interrogator says that he's blocking the memory of his own betrayal. Now, this aggravates Sinclair, and Sinclair then actually smashes his fist into his interrogator, who sort of fades out of the sim, and it turns out, as Sinclair says, that the pain is real for both of them. And we see that Sinclair is gradually clenching and flexing his fingers, just to sort of see if he can, what sort of control he has. Meanwhile, Ivanova and Delenn are walking on the promenade and discussing the situation, and Glenn's asking if the telepath Talia Winters could help find the commander, but Ivanova says that she isn't powerful enough to scan for him and she isn't trained for it. And Benson interestingly overhears this conversation, and this is obviously setting him to thinking. Back in the quarters where the mysterious duo have set up shop, they discuss how their interrogation is going, and the interrogator thinks that he's close, but he knows that they've got limited time. So what they decide to do is increase the drugs that they've got Sinclair on and power up the cybernet to a higher power level, and basically go back in and try and push him harder and faster to get the answers. We see a little clip now of a maintenance bot hunting for a body that Garibaldi says wouldn't have floated away from the station had it been pushed out. So obviously they're trying to cover all their bases and narrow things down. Garibaldi then finds out from one of his aides that they're using Benson in the search for the commander, and he asks why, because he was taken off active duty when they looked into his records with the gambling debt at the casino. But apparently his account is now mysteriously in credit, and it wasn't the last time Garibaldi checked it, which was only 24 hours ago. And of course Garibaldi, looking into it further, sees that he's been paying off his debts because he's had a massive chunk of cash come in out of the blue for no apparent reason, and it's well beyond what he should be earning as a lowly security officer. So Garibaldi knows that something is up with that, basically. Back in the sim, we see that Sinclair is getting control of his hand externally, but the cybernet strength is better now, and he's being forced to remember. And he remembers being surrounded by 9 grey cloaked figures in pools of light, one of whom is holding a staff. And he asks them, "What do you want?" And his question sort of echoes around him and back to him, and he gets knocked down by a blast from the staff wielder. At this point in the real world, we see that Benson comes into the quarters of the interrogators, and of course inevitably he comes on. He sees what's happening with the commander sat in this sort of chair-like apparatus that the two constructed, and he also sees the interrogator sat in a similar rig, but obviously one that's designed to allow him to be in control of everything. And that interrogator orders the other to terminate Benson, and he's just taken out by a PPG shot. So then we return back to the sim, and the interrogator says that both he and Sinclair are patriots in their own way. Benson's spaced corpse actually gives Garibaldi a way to narrow the search to Red Sector, because he knows that the guy couldn't have carried the body very far without being seen. So presumably the airlock it was found next to was in Red Sector, and that gives them the opportunity to narrow down their search parameters, because it's a big station at the end of the day. So trying to find him without any other additional information was very difficult. So actually Benson's done them a favour. So in the 24 hours that Sinclair can't remember, we are told that the Minbari surrendered on the eve of their final victory, and that Sinclair's ship was off scanners. According to the inquest that was held, there was a malfunction with the scanners during this period, but again, this is something the interrogator doesn't fully believe. He thinks that Sinclair's ship was elsewhere simply because he was collaborating with the Minbari. He thinks that the Minbari surrendered because they thought it would be too costly to invade Earth directly, so they decided to do it from within with a fifth column, with people like Sinclair. And there's a great use of lighting here in this scene to add weight to Sinclair's demeanour. He doesn't recognise anything the interrogator is alleging about him, about going over to the Minbari side, and he denounces his use of Mitchell to try and provoke a reaction. He says that he watched his squadron die one by one, and spent years trying to avoid the urge to kill Minbari on sight. Nothing has caused him to question his memory gap to this point, except what the rogue Minbari from the gathering told him, who we now see in flashback, that there was a hole in his mind, and his interrogator fixes on that. And Sinclair agrees that he does want to know for himself what happened, if nothing else. And the interrogator encourages him to go, look, see, now. And finally, we see the full sequence of what happened to Sinclair as he and his squadron engage the Minbari on the line. So Alpha 7 gets blown up almost immediately, and then basically so does everyone else, because one cruiser hit from a Minbari is basically more than sufficient to kill a star through with the direct shot. And so he just sees all of his squadron getting blown out of the sky around him. Sinclair's fury takes more of a glancing hit, possibly from one of the Minbari fighters, I think, because I don't think the beam is quite as thick as the beam that took out the other furies. And basically, it knocks his systems and his weapons offline, so he's virtually dead in space, but he's still got some control left. And he declares that he's going to take the bastards with him. So we see him setting up for a ramming run, but as he came into the shadow of the cruiser, it came around to meet him, disabled his ship, and then actually tracked him into its hangar bay. And we see him being carried on a stretcher deeper into the ship. And there's lots of sort of triangular symmetry here, and a triangular prism is held up in front of him, which glows as it's held up to him. And Sinclair is trussed up on a sort of a triangular construction of metal. We then move to see a much clearer image of the 9 figures that he saw earlier in a very, very large chamber with a sort of inverted mushroom with spotlights coming down off the bottom of it. And that's where the pools of light were coming from earlier. And Sinclair is in the middle of them, and he's asking them various questions, such as, what do you want? Why are you doing this? Who are you? And he steps towards one of them and unhoods one of them. He says, I know you. I know who you are. I know you. And again, he's blasted by the staff wielder in the circle. But with that action, Sinclair breaks free of his physical restraints in the real world, and he hits the interrogator, who is sat in his cyber rig next to him, causing him to writhe in pain and knocking him out. Sinclair manages to get up out of his seat, and he manages to deck the other interrogator and take his PPG, but he's delirious, and he still thinks that he's on the Minbari cruiser and is trying to get back to his ship. And as he moves through the station, he sees grey figures rather than humans and tries to hide from people. Back in the interrogator's quarters, the second man recovers, and he takes out another PPG as he moves to pursue Sinclair, killing a security officer who saw Sinclair but came under fire from Sinclair because Sinclair thought she was a Minbari. She does manage to call in her sighting of him before she gets taken out. So the commander crew now have a more accurate reference for his position, and Garibaldi heads for the area, while Ivanova speaks over a tannoy and asks Sinclair to report in. Delenn hears her announcement, and she also moves towards the area where she assumes that Sinclair is. And Sinclair comes out from where he was into a more sort of populated area onto the main corridor, I think. So Garibaldi comes on the scene at about the same time, and there's a sort of a crossfire between the guy who's chasing Sinclair and Garibaldi and Sinclair. But Garibaldi manages to wound his pursuer, and he passes out. But Sinclair then fires at Garibaldi, and Franklin, healthy at this point, leaks in to say he's been dosed with psychotropic drugs and could be dangerous, to which Garibaldi wryly responded that he had noticed. Delenn then appears on the scene and approaches Sinclair despite Garibaldi's protests and warnings to her, and Sinclair flashes back to the Minbari ship. And now we know that it was Delenn on the ship who Sinclair unhooded. So she was there as one of the 9 grey figures on the ship. And Sinclair shoots, but not at Delenn, but past Delenn, because his pursuer was preparing to fire at him again, having regained consciousness. And he takes him down. It turns out that Sinclair's interrogator is being turned over to Earth Force, who have claimed jurisdiction over the matter. And Garibaldi says there are rumours of covert ops to try and find out what really happened on the line, because fundamentally no one actually knows why the Minbari surrendered. Sinclair wants a word with him, despite having been out of it for a day, and despite Franklin telling him that effectively Sinclair fried this bloke's memory when he broke out of the cybernet. I assume on that basis that there was nothing for Talier to scan. When Sinclair speaks with him, he is pretty much out of it. But he does say, when he hears the word commander, he reacts to that. And he says that he wonders if they're both still inside. Now, that puzzled me for a little while, because it made me wonder whether or not they were, or Sinclair was sort of still inside a simulation, kind of into the longer term. But I think it's more a reference back to the fact that he now thinks he's still inside the simulation which he set up in the first place. So he's actually become lost in his own mind. I think is the meaning of that. So there's a nice little shot here of the landing bay area, which I don't think we've actually seen before. It's I think it's actually a sort of a painted image, but I'll leave a screenshot up for a while and you can have a look at it. Sinclair goes to Delenn's quarters to thank her for her help, and she asks if he remembers anything about his experience, and he claims that he was delusional and says no, he doesn't, because we know that he does remember seeing her on the ship. And interestingly, another Minbari with a silver triangular symbol on his forehead is in her quarters, who wants Sinclair dead if he does remember anything. I didn't remember that detail from when I first watched it. There's also something quite unusual about his eyes, so I think we're to infer that, notwithstanding Delenn's status, he is possibly sort of her superior in some way. because she's definitely taking what he's saying very, very seriously. And presumably he's come in from Minbar in the course of the day when Sinclair was still recovering from his experience. It's made clear from Sinclair's personal log at the end of the episode that he now recalls being tortured and interrogated on board the cruiser, and he realises that it was the Grey Council that he was brought before, but he doesn't understand why Delenn was there, although he knows that she's Satai, or why they blanked his memory, and he is now very determined to find out the truth behind what happened and how it links into the Battle of the Line as a whole. So that's where the episode ends, and this is a massive episode for the first season, because this sets so many things up, but it also references back to a lot of things. So what it basically does is it blows Sinclair's character development up massively, because this is a lot of his backstory, and it explains why possibly he's actually stuck at Commander, because there's a distinct question mark over the people who were involved at the Battle of the Line and who managed to survive, because they were basically getting wiped out wholesale. It pulls in the fact that it's been established over a number of episodes to this point that Delenn was a member of the Grey Council, and it places her squarely in the middle of the Battle of the Line, at the heart of events, which is very, very interesting. And yet now she's just an ambassador, so there's a question mark there as to why she's just an ambassador if she was so important to the war effort. And assuming that all members were there, we assume that there are 9 members of the Grey Council. You can just about make them out in the big shot of the chamber. You can just about count them all there. And I think there was a reference to 9 in the Minbari ceremony in Parliament of Dreams. So if you go back and watch that, you might find that there's a reference there. And we see a lot of references to, or sort of design indications that Minbari like 3s. So the Minbari fighters have 3 fins, the Minbari cruisers have 3 fins, lots of triangular structural elements, and of course 3 cubed is 9. So it's reinforcing certain things that we already knew about the Minbari, but what's really intriguing is all this has been very, very carefully set up to be revealed in this episode, because we've had pieces of this puzzle for a while, and now we have a slightly bigger, wider view of it from 10 years ago, but we're still missing quite a few key elements. And we see really in this episode the essence for the reason of the Babylon Station's creation, because Sinclair is adamant that there was no way Earth could have held out against the Minbari, and he understands that in a uniquely personal way, in terms of why the Babylon project has to succeed, because Earth can't afford for it not to. He was absolutely adamant that Earth would have been utterly trashed had the Minbari not stopped, because they were clearly massively technologically superior. And again, that then feeds into the messages that we got earlier in episodes like Infection, where we're told that Earth is very, very keen to gather up new technologies, basically anything to put it up on a par with races like the Minbari, because clearly their analysis and their experience of Minbari technology in the Earth-Minbari War basically laid bare just how far behind Earth was as compared with the older races. And it also explains why we would have to have been buying heavy weapons from the Narn if their weapons were better than what we had available, because we would have been completely desperate to try and improve our tactical abilities, given that we were getting absolutely smashed by the Minbari. What we don't find out is why the Minbari surrendered. We know that they examined Sinclair, but we don't know if he was the only pilot examined, nor do we know why he was brought before the Grey Council. We don't know who sent the human interrogators in this episode, or why exactly, and it seems like a very, very obvious job for a telepath to be involved in. And the fact that there wasn't one involved suggests that this wasn't a psycho operation. So either it's an independent group who are obsessed with the Battle of the Line in a sort of pro-Earth way, which again we've seen hinted at in previous episodes, or it's another arm of the government that is operating independently of Psi Corps, who sent these guys in as a covert ops unit, as Garibaldi hinted. But maybe that's too obvious a hint. It was kind of, it's a very sort of obvious statement from Garibaldi, and it's not really clear whether that's there to throw us off the scent or not. So you can take that as you choose to, really. As you might imagine, this was the sort of episode that sent the Usenet newsgroups of the time into meltdown with speculation. And it fundamentally demonstrated the underlying depth of the show, because there were so many previously established plot elements being brought into this episode and being kept in play, whilst also in turn interlinking the events in this episode to 10 years in the past by reference to the show's present day. This is just episode 8. So all this sort of character development and sort of the gentle introduction to the characters is now over and done with. And this is arguably sort of the first episode to really give you a payoff for having followed the show through to this point and having actually paid attention to it. Because if you've paid attention to it, then you can pick up on all these snippets and say, well, hang on a minute, yeah, I remember that. That was set up here, that was set up there. And so you start to see just how much planning has gone into this. And let's just pause and consider for a moment that the sheer volume of CGI shots in this episode was apparently greater than the CGI shots used in the pilot episode, which was The Gathering, for the show as a whole. And they did this in a single episode of the first season of the show. And trying to sort of work that into a normal sort of shooting schedule must have been an incredible effort to get done. But it's quite cleverly done as well, if you think about it, because we see little snippets of what is effectively a single scene, and then we see the final amalgamation of all those elements we've seen to date, but plus some new elements. And this is fundamentally Sinclair's backstory up to this point, is that he has quite a dark history with the Minbari, and yet he's ended up on a station in charge of trying to keep the peace that's been forged with them, and yet we just don't know how that peace actually came to be or why. So we come to the end of this sort of first, it's not even halfway through the first season, but we're nearly halfway through the first season, and we now have a very different perspective on the scope of the story. So we're not really talking about just stories set on a space station. What we're talking about is the history of Earth and the Minbari, how the other races interacted with that story, and whether or not we can now actually sort of move forward from this point and take that relationship further. And we're left with the question of how is Sinclair going to resolve what happened to him and figure out exactly what did happen and what will the implications of that be if he does find out. So I've heard a lot of people recently saying sort of don't bother with the first season of Babylon 5, and I knowing what I know, I can sort of see that argument. But equally, if you completely miss out the first season, then you don't really get a feel for how much it actually set up in the first place, just in the first season. And it would have been impossible for it to do that had it not all been pre-planned. And it would also have been impossible to do that had they not been able to do what they were doing with CGI effects, because there must have been about sort of 12 Star Furies in that squadron, give or take. And trying to do that with models, it just wouldn't have been possible with conventional physical models on the sort of budget that they wouldn't have had. So CGI was the only way that they were going to be able to achieve that, and they achieved it brilliantly. Because okay, fine, it's not as slick as modern day CGI. Well, no, of course it isn't. It's 20 years out of date now, more than that. So, but what they did achieve was they managed to cram all of that into a single episode of a TV show, and it's just never been done before. So, phenomenal that they managed to pull it off at that point in time. So, you know, it's definitely well worth rewatching these. I mean, I'm very much loving sort of rewatching them and doing this sort of analysis for you as I go, because I say I haven't watched them for a long time, as you know, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it and thoroughly appreciating as well the sheer level of sort of professionalism and care that went into crafting this series, because there is a lot of love going in here between the costumes, the sounds, the special effects, the writing. This is a massive arc episode. Strangely, I couldn't actually find on the video where JMS was credited for it, but it's categorically one of his, because he takes care with these particular episodes to make sure that they fit into his Bible for the show. So again, it's one of my longer sort of spiels, but try and watch the episode yourself if you are unfamiliar with it. It's really well done. The acting is very good, I think, and I think the interrogator and Sinclair have a lot of sort of airtime in this episode, but it's played out really well. There's quite a lot of sort of variance to it, and I think it holds up really well. I think even the effects hold up really well, and it's our first look at the sort of Minbari war machine and exactly how strong the Minbari are as well as a sort of a spacefaring species. And yeah, so this just sets things up for where, with the direct sort of direction the show is going, what this show is actually capable of doing, because the Battle of the Line is completely nothing to do with Babylon 5. It happened 10 years before Babylon 5. So we've moved completely off the station, as we did actually, in fairness, with Midnight on the Firing Line as well. But again, it's just showing that although the show is about the station, it's not going to limit itself to being on the station all the time. And its ambition is much larger than that, which I think is what endeared it to so many people at the time, and results in its ongoing fandom, like me, still being around 20 odd years later. So I shall leave it there, and I will join you for the next one in about a week's time, all being well. Thanks very much.